The missing keys were never found. Days passed. The family searched every corner of the farmhouse. They checked cupboards, drawers, storage rooms, even the barn. But the keys had simply vanished. No one could explain where they had gone. For most families, losing a set of keys would have been a minor inconvenience. At Hinterkaifeck, it felt different. The strange footsteps, the mysterious tracks in the snow, the missing keys. Each event by itself could have been dismissed as a coincidence. Together, they formed a pattern that no one could fully understand. And then, another strange discovery appeared. One afternoon, Andreas Gruber found a newspaper lying near the farmhouse. It wasn't unusual for newspapers to exist. What was unusual was that no one in the family had bought it. No one recognized it. No one knew where it had come from. The nearest neighbors hadn't left it there. The local postman hadn't delivered it. It had simply appeared. The family looked through every page, hoping to find some clue. But there was nothing that explained how it had arrived. Someone had brought it to the farm. Or someone had already been there. Again, there was no proof. Only another unanswered question. Looking back today, historians agree on one thing. The weeks before the tragedy were filled with unusual events. The footsteps, the footprints, the missing keys, the unknown newspaper. All of these reports were later mentioned during the investigation. But at the time, no one realized how important they might become. Life on the farm continued. The animals still needed to be fed. The fields still needed attention. Meals were prepared as they always had been. The children laughed and played. From the outside, Hinterkaifeck still looked like an ordinary farmhouse. Yet beneath that ordinary routine, something felt wrong. Something invisible seemed to be drawing closer with every passing day. Whether it was a person watching from the forest, someone secretly moving around the property, or simply a series of frightening coincidences, no one knew. And perhaps, no one ever would. As March came to an end, the evenings grew a little quieter. The cold wind still drifted across the empty fields. Smoke rose gently from the farmhouse chimney. Inside, the family prepared for another ordinary night. They had no way of knowing that it would be their last peaceful evening together. The sun would soon disappear beyond the trees. Darkness would once again surround Hinterkaifeck. And before another morning arrived, the quiet farmhouse would become the center of one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. What happened during that night, and what investigators discovered afterward, changed the story of Hinterkaifeck forever.
In the next episode, one morning, Andreas Gruber stepped outside as he had done countless times before. The air was cold. A thin layer of fresh snow covered the ground around the farmhouse. Everything looked quiet, until he noticed something unusual. There were footprints. They began at the edge of the forest, one set, deep enough to suggest they had been made by an adult. The footprints crossed the open field and led directly toward Hinterkaifeck. At first, there was nothing alarming about that. Travelers sometimes crossed farmland. Hunters occasionally walked through the woods. But these footprints were different. They didn't continue past the farmhouse. They didn't turn back toward the forest. Andreas followed them carefully, step by step. The tracks ended near the farm. There were no footprints leading away. Whoever had walked across that snowy field had apparently arrived, but never left. For a long moment, Andreas simply stood there, looking at the snow, looking back toward the dark forest, trying to understand what he was seeing. Perhaps the wind had erased the return tracks. Perhaps he had simply missed them. He searched again, slowly, carefully, but the result was always the same. Only footprints leading toward the farmhouse, none leading away. He eventually returned inside. The family discussed what he had found. No one could explain it. There was no evidence of a break-in. Nothing appeared to be missing. The animals behaved normally, but doors were still locked. Life continued. But from that day forward, the strange noises inside the farmhouse no longer seemed so easy to ignore. Every creak above the ceiling carried a different meaning. Every sound outside made someone stop and listen. Even the forests surrounding Hinterkaifeck seemed different. The trees stood motionless, as though they were hiding a secret. Today, historians still debate those mysterious footprints. Some believe drifting snow may have covered the return tracks. Others suggest the visitor might have remained somewhere on the property. There is no evidence that proves either theory, and that uncertainty has kept the mystery alive for more than a century. If the footprints had been the only strange event, perhaps the family would have forgotten about them. But they weren't. Soon afterward, another unsettling discovery would leave Andreas Gruber even more confused. His keys had disappeared. No one remembered moving them. No one admitted taking them. The family searched every room, every drawer, every shelf, every pocket. The keys were simply gone. At first, it seemed like nothing more than an inconvenience. People misplace things. That happens in every home. But when the missing keys were placed beside the footsteps and the unexplained sounds from the attic,
a disturbing pattern slowly began to emerge. Someone, or something, seemed to know the farmhouse far better than the family realized, and the next clue would make that possibility even harder to ignore.
The woman who worked at Hinterkaifeck had spent enough time inside the farmhouse to know its ordinary sounds. She knew how the wooden stairs creaked. She knew how the barn echoed during windy nights. She knew the sound of animals moving in their stalls. But the noises coming from above were different. Every evening, after darkness settled over the farm, she began hearing slow footsteps somewhere inside the attic. Not running, not loud, just slow, deliberate steps, back and forth, as if someone was walking carefully, making sure not to be seen. At first, she said nothing. Perhaps she was imagining it. Perhaps exhaustion was playing tricks on her mind. Farm life was hard. Long days often made people hear things that weren't really there. But the footsteps continued, night after night. Sometimes they lasted only a few seconds. Other times they continued for several minutes before suddenly stopping. The silence that followed was somehow even more unsettling. Finally, she gathered the courage to tell the family. She explained that she believed someone, or something, was moving above the ceiling after dark. The family listened, but they found no reason to panic. Andreas Gruber searched the attic. He carried a lantern through every corner. He looked behind old wooden beams. He checked piles of hay and storage boxes. He found nothing. No broken window. No signs of forced entry. No footprints. Nothing that could explain the strange sounds. The most logical explanation was simple. Perhaps rats had made a nest inside the roof, or maybe the old timber was shifting as the weather changed. Life continued, but the maid was no longer convinced. Each passing night made her more frightened. She no longer felt comfortable walking through the farmhouse after sunset. Even simple chores became difficult. Every shadow seemed darker. Every sound made her stop and listen. Eventually, she made a decision. She packed her belongings, and she left Hinterkaifeck. Before leaving, she reportedly told the family that the house felt haunted. Whether she truly believed in ghosts, or whether she simply sensed that something wasn't right, no one can say for certain. But one fact is clear. She refused to spend another night inside that farmhouse. Today, historians generally believe she left because she was frightened by the unexplained noises. What caused those noises has never been proven. Some believe they came from animals. Others have suggested that an unknown person may have been hiding somewhere on the property. There is no evidence that confirms either explanation. And that uncertainty is one reason the mystery still fascinates people today. The family, however, stayed. They continued feeding the animals, working in the fields, living their daily lives.
As if nothing had changed. But the strange events were only beginning. Within days, something else would happen. Something impossible to explain. Fresh footprints would appear in the snow. They would lead toward the farmhouse.
but no footprints would ever lead away. That discovery would change everything.
There are places where silence feels wrong, places where the wind seems to carry memories instead of sound. In the spring of 1922, hidden beyond the forests of Bavaria, Germany, stood a lonely farmhouse called Hinterkaifeck. From a distance, it looked completely ordinary. A small farmhouse, a wooden barn, open fields stretching toward the horizon. A family living a simple farming life. Nothing about it suggested that it would one day become one of the world's most famous unsolved mysteries. Even now, more than 100 years later, people still ask the same question: what really happened at Hinterkaifeck? To understand the mystery, we have to go back to a very different world. A world without electricity in every home, without television, without mobile phones, without security cameras. Life in rural Bavaria moved at the pace of nature. Farmers woke before sunrise. The sound of horses, chickens, and cattle filled the mornings. Children helped in the fields before they were old enough to understand how difficult life truly was. Every season brought new work. Every winter tested every family, and every neighbor depended on one another. But Hinterkaifeck was different. Unlike most farms in the area, it stood alone, far away from the nearest village, surrounded by fields on one side and dense forests on the other. If you stood outside after sunset, the only sounds you would hear were the wind, the trees, and the distant cries of wild animals somewhere beyond the darkness. It was peaceful, or at least it appeared to be. The people who lived there worked hard every single day. The head of the household was Andreas Gruber, a farmer known throughout the region as a strict and disciplined man. His wife, Cecilia, managed the home while helping with the endless work around the farm. Living with them was their widowed daughter, who was also named Cecilia. She cared for her 2 young children, little Cecilia, only 7 years old, and Joseph, just a small boy. Together, the family lived much like every other farming family in Bavaria. They cared for livestock, harvested crops, repaired fences, prepared meals, and survived each season through hard work. To anyone passing by, nothing seemed unusual. Neighbors occasionally saw smoke rising from the chimney, children playing outside, animals moving inside the barn. Everything looked normal. Everything looked safe. But sometimes, the most dangerous places are the ones that look the most ordinary. As winter slowly faded into spring, the forests around Hinterkaifeck remained cold and silent. Snow still covered parts of the ground. The evenings arrived early. Darkness settled over the farm long before bedtime. Inside the farmhouse, old wooden floors creaked with every step.
The wind slipped through tiny gaps in the walls. Lanterns cast long shadows across the rooms. And when the fire burned low, the silence returned. It was the kind of silence that made even the smallest sound impossible to ignore. A loose floorboard, a door moving in the wind, a branch brushing against the roof. Every noise seemed louder than it should have been. But the family had lived there for years. They knew every sound the old farmhouse could make. Which is exactly why the new sounds frightened them. At first, they were easy to dismiss. A faint creak above the ceiling. A slow footstep somewhere overhead. Maybe it was the old wood expanding in the cold. Maybe it was an animal. That seemed like the most reasonable explanation. Until the sounds returned. Again and again. Always at night. Always from above. No one knew it then, but the first warning had already arrived. And within a few days, a woman working at the farmhouse would become so terrified that she would refuse to spend another night inside Hinterkaifeck. The real mystery was only beginning.